Doug, these protests, good morning. These protests are the biggest show of defiance against China's ruling Communist Party in decades. Are they just about Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy, or is there more at play here?
No, they're quickly becoming a much broader public protest, really a public show of defiance and anger against the ruling Communist Party. And like you said, this is an extremely rare show of defiance in China, public show of defiance, a rare rebuke for the all-powerful paramount Communist Party. Look, it obviously started. You always have to have a trigger for these things. And in China, you know, we've seen protests before. Often it's some local issue, an environmental issue. What makes these so different is that you're right that there was that deadly fire in the western city, the far western city of Urumqi, which a lot of the residents blamed the COVID lockdowns, the restrictions there, for essentially trapping people in their homes, hampering the efforts of the rescue workers to get to these people to save them. So blaming COVID, something the authorities have denied. But regardless of that, all that was needed, and you said the word spark, and it's very appropriate here, all that was needed was that sort of tragedy as a spark to set a fire which is now spread across China. And that fire, in a sense, which has highlighted all of the frustration, Allison, all of the anger, all of the depression, if you will, that the pent-up anger that residents people across China have felt over these COVID restrictions, all of that has now been channeled, if you will, and used as a lightning rod for these broader protests. Pent-up feelings now, protests against, as you said, against and the lack of democracy, the lack of freedom, the lack of ability to protest in China. So it is remarkable, in a sense, that these COVID restrictions have sort of given vent to much broader pent-up feelings of anger and frustration at a Communist Party that we don't normally see. We haven't really seen this on this scale since going back to the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy protests, which were brutally, bloodily crushed by the Communist Party back in 1989. Now, we're not there yet, obviously. These protests, just to be sure, are relatively small in the context of over 1 billion people in China. But the fact that they are happening in so many cities at once and that you have hundreds, often, of people gathering, as you see here, it is absolutely unprecedented. Unbelievable is the word, in a sense.
And it's unbelievable and remarkable, as you said, Doug, also because we do have this popular perception that Chinese citizens don't often protest, but that's not actually true. You were saying that studies suggest that the protest is more prevalent in Chinese society than meets the eye.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, this popular perception, because we don't often see it. We haven't seen anything on this scale. Oh, well, the Chinese are just going to be docile. They're subservient to the will of their Communist Party masters. They never have a bone of protesting fiber in their bodies. It's just untrue. I want to show you something. Freedom House in the United States, which sort of researches and tracks democracy around the world, as the name suggests. I put together some statistics of a recent sort of survey they've done. It's really interesting. Dissent in China. Even before these latest zero COVID protests, from June to September of this year, so going back 2 months, 636 real-world protests. That means offline, not online protests, in the real world, people gathering, at least 8,775 total participants. You say that's a drop in the bucket in China, 1 billion-plus people. But still, it's remarkable that it's happening at all on this scale, 636 of them. We're seeing demonstrations of the kind we're seeing now. We've seen strikes. We've seen occupations, not just about zero COVID, about environmental policies, about local grievances. Often the top grievance, interestingly, is delayed housing projects, real estate. It touches off a lot of protests. It's not the sole reason, but it's a big reason. And there have been, this is significant, 47 large-scale events. Large-scale I defined as 100 to 999 people. That's significant, too. We haven't really heard much about these large-scale events. But once again, going back to what I said before, the fact that in a police state which allows no protest, that you would even have people brave enough to sort of risk their lives and livelihoods and their freedom to go out onto the streets is remarkable. So no, Chinese people are not as docile as popular perception suggests. They have been protesting, and they were protesting before these zero COVID protests, but these have just become so big and so widespread that now the whole world's talking about them.
And now that the whole world is talking about them, Doug, what do we expect to hear from Xi Jinping? Could he decide to actually ease those COVID restrictions?
Will he ease them? Yes, he's already actually. There has been in recent weeks some easing of restrictions, it's been, mass testing, lockdowns, quarantine. So they've been easing the time of quarantines, also changing the rules regarding foreign airlines bringing people into China. But it's an easing and it's not a lifting, and that's a real distinction here. My sense is that Xi Jinping is going to see these off. He is not going to let these protests cow him. He is not going to let these protesters change or reverse his zero COVID policies. Remember, he just secured an unprecedented third term in power at a party congress last month. He's essentially president for life. He's perhaps the most powerful leader China has seen since Mao Zedong. His immediate authority is not in jeopardy, but that doesn't mean the Communist Party leadership can simply stand there and ride this out with doing nothing. They are going to, if not heed the protesters' message, and obviously he's not going to resign, they probably will ease the restrictions a bit, and they will probably try to be savvy in their management of these protests. They know the world is watching. They can't go perhaps full Tiananmen, meaning they can't just simply go out there and crush these protests as they would over 30 years ago in Tiananmen. But I predict that no, the Communist Party and its monopoly on power is not in threat. Yes, there will be some further easings and adjustments of the zero COVID policy. But no, Xi Jinping is not about to step down, far from it. The Communist Party is not about to relinquish its role as the only arbiter of Chinese life and destiny. And it's not about to simply give these protesters the streets indefinitely. There's going to come a point at which they will, and we've already seen it happening, start arresting, start squashing, and start suppressing these protests. And they'll also look to suppress it over the internet, which has been the way a lot of people have been finding out about what's going on.
All right, we'll see if your predictions prove true, Doug. Thank you as always for your analysis. That's France 24's International Affairs Commentator, Douglas Herbert.